Howdy. Gather round the campfire, because Thomas has some truly spine-chilling episodes. In fact, there's a notorious collection of these classic dark episodes that's been piling up since the Blue Sentient Locomotive's debut in 1984. These fully autonomous engines are sometimes harshly punished for their poor behavior, including trapping them for all eternity, scrapping them altogether, and surprisingly often, burying them alive. What's creepiest of all is these punishments often come straight from their director-in-chief, the sinister and devious Sir Topham Hatt, the true villain, Thomas the Tank Engine. Anyway, let's check out the top 10 darkest Thomas the Tank Engine episodes. And of course, since we're talking dark kid shows, we should invite the master of dark.
Oh, hey Strider, it's nice to be back. Need a hand talking about this PBS classic?
Hey, welcome back, George. Good to see you, man. I sure do. I think we do better justice to these darker episodes together. You ready for this?
Let's do it. It's been a while.
Okay, great. On to the countdown. Scaredy Engines, the classic Halloween special of Thomas and Friends. On the island of Sodor, a new moon has set on Halloween night, and the ever-vicious Edward Engine tells his disturbing tales of trains being mauled and scrapped on the stroke of midnight. And of course, he tells us of the sinister Ghost Engine returning from the smelters.
As Edward finishes his campfire story, their director, Topham Hatt, returns. He's assigning them their midnight missions.
Thomas, Percy, and Jorge, I have a special job for you.
So Thomas and Percy are assigned to graveyard smelter duty. Demonic dark colors envelop the railroad. Mysterious sparks cover the ceiling, and what looks to be guillotines precariously hang from above.
Actually, I think that's just a piece of scrap, though we're never actually told. The episode sets the atmosphere well. The smelters are nearly pitch black, bathed with only a blood-red light. The use of lights and visuals really stand out here.
To get revenge on Thomas for his teasing, Duck requests Thomas be left behind to do all the remaining work. So Duck and Percy bail, and Thomas is left alone at the smelters.
When Thomas was by himself, every sound and every shadow was spooky.
The tension really builds when Thomas is alone. Even the background sounds of the smelters feel unearthly and ghostly. Thomas's mind begins to play tricks on him.
The way these visuals distort and warp in the pitch black is legitimately unnerving, and Thomas reminding himself that there's no such thing as ghosts doesn't seem to help him much.
There's no such things as ghosts, he said nervously.
As Thomas gets covered in chains, he flees in terror, disappearing into the night. But Percy feels bad for Thomas and goes looking for him.
Terrified, Thomas is remorseful, and he's sorry to Percy for teasing him. So the two decide to watch the Halloween fireworks from back at the station. It's a very pleasant finish.
We can watch the fireworks just as well from here. And he was right.
Ghost Train. This time, Percy's the one to tell us a campfire story of the ghost train his driver saw last night. It was covered in web and shrouded in mist.
When Percy sets on his mission that evening, Sodor now has an ambience closer to a horror movie. It's near pitch black, fog spews everywhere, and even the trees have become ragged, barren, and twisted.
Possibly due to his horribly inadequate headlights, Percy crashes into a crate of lime and is covered in ghostly white. But truly, the most horrifying thing in this episode of all is this face. Having been teased by Thomas earlier, Percy goes back to his station covered in lime and terrifies Thomas.
I'll chuff and I'll puff and I'll break your door in. It's getting late. Oh, I'd no idea. Oh, I must find Annie and Clarabelle.
Thomas then disappears all night. Once again, hats off for the visuals in this episode. When Percy chugs out into the night, the model railroad and use of dark and smoke really create a thrilling setting.
You know, it's surprising how often Thomas is the villain in the show. In both these last two episodes, he teases Percy and ends up getting his retribution when he gets spooked.
True, but I kinda like that though. It shows Thomas isn't perfect and that he's a flawed, multi-layered character. He can be inconsiderate, but like all of us, he can also be a hero. It credits the kids watching with some intelligence, and I appreciate that. Grandpuff Duke has some stories to tell. Stories of imprisonment and retribution. He starts with a story of a misbehaving engine, the that was promptly turned into a generator.
He's still there behind our shed. He'll never move again.
Trapped in a never-ending limbo, not quite dead or alive.
After that, Stuart and Falcon became really useful engines.
Yeah, I'm sure they would be. And all you had to do was terrify them into submission with stories of being entombed for all eternity. Back to the old ways. Good job, Grandpuff.
When the gold mines and railways closed, the engines were sold off to the highest bidders.
All except Duke. The buyers thought Duke was too old, so he was abandoned in a shed. And we watch as he's locked away, alone in a tiny cramped shed indefinitely. Ugh. And we watch the years pass by as he's slowly more and more buried alive. And...
winter torrents wash soils from the hills.
oh, come on. What is it with this blue train show and sealing its characters away for all eternity? I get Mother Nature can bury whoever she wants, but this is just sad. Years go by and Duke is completely buried deep within the mountain, never to see the light of day again.
That's not a happy ending.
I agree, Percy. That was a horrible story, and it doesn't make sense, because Grandpuff is right here.
Well, don't worry. Many years later, Topham Hatt orders Duke to be found again, after rescuers request it. Apparently this railway crew want to make Duke happy again.
We want to find Duke, they said, and make him happy again.
Oh, well, that's very nice of them. But if they felt that way, why did they leave him for dead to begin with?
I don't know. Maybe back then their railway line couldn't afford to house them in a proper station. After all, everyone at the gold mine was laid off work.
Maybe. Well, either way, it's a very strange tale. And even as an adult, the tale makes me weirdly uncomfortable. I don't know, maybe it makes me think of grave digging or our tiny insignificance in the universe. I wonder how kids took this episode. The Flying Kipper.
This was a potentially fatal disaster, and certainly among the most chilling crashes in the show's history.
Yep, and it all arose from one minor error. You see, it was Henry's job to be the Flying Kipper, the train that hauls supplies to the docks. But it's such an icy cold morning that the train switch freezes, leading Henry hurtling down the wrong tracks at dangerous speeds, oblivious that he's about to completely rip apart a goods train and nearly crush the driver and fireman.
By pure luck, the driver and fireman leave just in time, right before Henry completely obliterates the train in a vicious collision.
There's some great use of pacing here, with long still holds on Henry's silent, miserable face as we take in the carnage he's caused.
Fortunately, Topham Hatt gets Henry rebuilt, and even upgrades his engine, so Henry's back to his old self in no time.
Still, I appreciate that this show is demonstrating severe consequences to kids. How one small mistake can potentially lead to major disasters if we're not careful. Duncan gets spooked. This episode starts pretty brutal for a little kid's show, with the presumably also sentient train cars getting mischievous, detaching from their engine and swiftly plummeting to their death in a ravine. It puzzles me why this show is so gentle with its engines, yet so harsh on the carriages. I mean, sure, they're jerks, but I don't think they deserve to be thrown into a ravine. They even give a close-up of the carnage, but the driver just seems so blasé about the whole thing.
The Fat Controller will be very annoyed.
Well, we've seen that these engines can survive without oxygen, so maybe they'll be fine.
Yeah, I guess they could be, if they can manage to drag these massive things out of the swamp.
Rusty later tells Duncan a story of an engine that was killed when it fell off a bridge. The story tells that the ghost of this train is eternally trying to cross the bridge, but it continually falls every time.
Duncan, unsurprisingly, doesn't believe the story, and who can blame him? I wouldn't either. So the drivers and engines all rather sadistically conspire behind his back. Their goal? To scare the bejeebus out of Duncan.
And make him believe the wrath of ghostly spirits. Ooh ha 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 ha.
Well, anyway, Duncan's driver gets him to cross the supposedly haunted bridge at night. This leaves Duncan visibly nervous.
And since apparently Duncan isn't terrified enough yet...
Next, his driver secretly threw a rock from the cab into the ravine below.
I'm just amazed what jerks everyone is being to Duncan. Duncan's so petrified with fear that he backs up the bridge, tears back to his shed, and refuses to open his eyes.
Spooked, are you, Duncan? Laughed his driver. No! wailed Duncan. I'm asleep! And refused to open his eyes.
And that's the end of the story. And honestly, the message in this one felt a bit messed up to me. I certainly hope kids don't purposely try to scare their friends that claim they don't believe in ghosts. I think questioning your imagination and looking for scientific evidence is a very rational viewpoint, and I'd encourage it in kids. When we're in the dentist chair, do we believe how much time we feel we've been out, or do we believe our watch? Haunted Henry. Henry may be back in action, but he's not out of the woods yet. In fact, he's about to enter a haunted woods. The writers of Thomas seem to really enjoy telling these spooky campfire stories, often letting the viewer's imagination do a lot of the heavy lifting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. In these ghost episodes, there's often a good use of eerie silences and fog. I think this can encourage a very intense fear, the fear of the unknown.
Henry's working late with Edward, and then an owl hoots. Edward warns that the owl hooting is the sign of a dark mist and a ghostly spectre. And soon enough, a mist wafts in, surrounding Henry on all sides. As Henry drives through the mist, strange things start to happen without reason. Lamps turn on without notice. Lights flicker within abandoned buildings. Gates close by themselves. And most scary of all, mysterious, unidentifiable items are randomly left on the track.
I think that's a coat? But the question remains, how did it appear in the middle of the night?
Things get worse as Henry's terrified carriages crash through the closed gate.
A mysterious figure watched Henry go by,
leading to a massive landslide on the tracks.
In another of the most shocking scenes of the series, the entire train crashes at the landslide and careens off a ravine. Only Henry manages to brake in time.
Despite this massive, and I'm gonna guess expensive, disaster, Henry's driver and firemen seem surprisingly kipper, and they soon realize the mysterious figure was actually just old Bailey the Fogman, who mostly just seems to want his job back.
I'd like to operate that old station again, if you let me. I promise I won't spook Henry.
What about the obliterated carriages, though? They've got those same creepy, uncanny faces too. Does that mean they're also sentient and capable of self-determination?
Well, either way, it's another interesting dark episode with a fun mystery and a great build-up.
Percy and the Haunted Mine. This is another of those episodes that's really skillful at building the mystery and tension. This time, Percy is forced to stop at the haunted mine. Why? Because good old Topham wants bushes for the most beautiful station contest. Perfect reason to send the ever-timid Percy to the haunted mine in the middle of the night.
You could cut the tension of this place with a knife. While Percy's at the stop signal of the abandoned mine, the ancient chimney begins to sink into the ground, mysteriously vanishing. Terrified, Percy takes off.
But apparently, because it wasn't enough the first time, Topham Hatt sends Percy back the next night too.
I want you to collect some trucks from the abandoned mine, he said. Yes, sir.
Why did you leave your trucks at the abandoned mine anyway, Topham? It's abandoned.
Percy reluctantly returns, and we get some more ghostly scenery. Smog and dark shadows cover the abandoned mine, and Percy is noticeably tense.
This time, the whole dang building sinks into the ground. Earthquakes rumble as the ground spews fumes of smoke and gas. It's like the underworld opened up before them to swallow Percy and his driver up.
In his terror, Percy accidentally rams the truck in front of him and outpours an avalanche of gnomes.
Wait, hold on. Gnomes?
Topham Hatt was going to use them to decorate the station. Apparently he considers them good luck.
Well, at least Percy's able to work through his fear, return to the mine, collect the, gnomes, and return to the station. And apparently the controller's gnomes turn the tide and let them win the competition for the most beautiful station.
I don't know, if I saw those things at my local train station, I think I'd be creeped out.
Yeah, if I saw these, I think I'd just want to kick them over.
Percy was scared, but he knew he had to be responsible, so he carried on.
Toby and the Flood. This episode's straight to the point, with Toby being rapidly surrounded by a torrential flood. It's a steady build-up as the danger increases around Toby.
There is a legitimate threat of Toby and his driver being killed in this one. washed away by the flood if the dam breaks or the bridge collapses.
If the dam breaks, we'll be done for.
And every second Toby waits, the flood is getting worse and the bridge is more likely to collapse. But then, the worst does happen as the dam breaks, letting forth a roaring thunder of savage floodwater, threatening to drown Toby and his driver. Can trains be drowned? I don't know, what do you think, George?
Well, given we've seen these trains trapped underground for years before, I'm guessing they're safe from needing oxygen.
Well, anyway, the bridge rips apart from under Toby, sending him tearing across the flood, at the mercy of Mother Nature's whims. And just to make matters even worse, a waterfall is rapidly approaching for them to plunge into, which doesn't always end well.
Luckily, Harold the helicopter arrives, giving Percy a rope to pull Toby to safety, but Toby and his driver narrowly avoid falling to their deaths in this episode.
With a great building of tension and fear as the flood gets more and more dangerous, Toby and the Flood is exhilarating, a great dark episode. Rusty and the Boulder. This episode is pretty notorious, mainly for this big ugly mound of evil right here. This is Boulder, the mysterious, malicious, self-aware Boulder that sat high in the mountains for many a year.
Apart from Talking Engines, Thomas is a show mostly grounded in reality. It regularly explains to children that the supernatural is make-believe. But this episode seems to be the exception.
A new quarry is set up at the mountain. Rusty's on the job, but is afraid this looming boulder atop the mountain will fall onto the line. Which seems like a perfectly reasonable concern. You could blow that thing off the edge, it's so precarious. Soon Edward arrives with a machine to help with mining. Yet, for some reason, everyone is too thick-headed to check on the giant mysterious boulder precariously hanging from the top of the mountain.
Don't be so daft, it can't, said Rusty's driver.
Really? Why could this giant boulder in wet weather on the top of the mountain you've been mining not move?
It's rolling along our line.
Rusty and his driver quickly back away as the boulder hurtles towards them. It's actually pretty admirable how calm they keep in this life-threatening situation.
Dang right. I'd be laying bricks if a massive boulder this size was crashing towards me. It's barely a meter away from squishing them like a bug. In fact, I think these two deserve some music.
Rusty narrowly avoids being crushed, changing tracks just in time as Boulder thunders past them, but boulders soon after his next unsuspecting victim, Scaredy.
Yikes!
Scaredy narrowly avoids it too, but Boulder continues to gain frightening levels of speed, and soon this rampant self-aware monster is after Rheneas.
His driver drove him back as fast as he could.
Finally, Boulder reaches Percy at the mining station, and with a thunderous crash and a blazing inferno, it crashes into the station.
And when the Fat Controller arrives, even he has to admit the most obvious fact since the start of this episode.
We should have left this part of the island alone, he said thoughtfully.
Nah, you think? 4 of your trains nearly smashed to pieces and 4 of your drivers nearly brutally crushed to death by a giant precarious self-aware boulder at the top of the mountain looming over you. I mean, how could anyone have predicted anything would go wrong?
And the episode ends with the ghostly boulder looking up in the dark of the night,
ready for its next rampage of destruction. Honestly, I really liked this episode. It was kind of cool seeing all the trains react both suddenly and without hesitation in the face of immediate danger. I think it's a good lesson to kids about staying calm, thinking on their feet, and trusting their instincts in moments like that.
Rather a smash than a squash.
And before we get to number 1, just a couple of quick honourable mentions. The sad story of Henry. Since I covered this before in Darkest PBS, I left it in the honourable mentions. Henry has this way of getting continually punished in this show. In this case, he just randomly decides he doesn't want to get his coat of paint dirty and stays under the bridge. Their ever sinister controller decides to take this as a sign that Henry never wants to move again. So he has all his evil lackeys brick Henry up and take away his tracks, leaving him to watch indefinitely as trains pass by his tomb. But it turns out it wasn't indefinitely, because in the very next episode, Edward, Gordon, and Henry, he's let out. I guess he couldn't have starred in so many adventures on this list so far if he had been left in there. I like Henry, so I'm glad we got him back. Stepney Gets Lost. This is another one I covered in Darkest PBS, and I'd say it's among my favorite dark episodes for this show, with Stepney being abducted and taken to be scrapped. But luckily, he's saved just in time by the Fat Controller, Donald and Douglas, aka Brake Van. Okay, I just had to mention this one for this particular scene.
Go steady, the van's breaking. The van was in pieces. No one had been hurt.
Excuse me? Big decapitated head of this brake van you crushed to death? Like, it's got a face too, and it talks. I'm guessing you guys just killed yet another sentient locomotive capable of abstract thought. You probably shouldn't be quite so chipper about this. Topham, how are you going to deal with this?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Well, in that case, let's move on to number 1. Escape. Fun fact, I still vaguely remember having this episode on tape when I was 5. This was one of my favorite episodes because it felt really exciting, even if I didn't fully understand what was going on in the episode, and the really creepy undertones. This episode discusses the biggest threat these trains constantly have looming over them, being scrapped. And the episode doesn't shy away from this topic.
Scrap, said Edward quietly. Douglas gasped. Don't mention that word. It makes my wheels wobble.
It's a pretty dark part of their livelihoods. When Topham Hatt doesn't have a use for these engines anymore, he can scrap them anytime. Apparently, Edward originally met Trevor by saving him from being scrapped.
And that very night, when Douglas takes some goods away to a faraway diesel yard.
Are you a Fat Controller's engine? I'm Oliver. But what are you doing? Escaping? From what? Scrap?
So like any decent, self-aware life form capable of higher order thinking would do, he tries to save him from his certain doom.
I'll be glad to help you.
To escape the diesel yard, Douglas disguises Oliver as scrap being hauled away. But wouldn't Topham Hatt be the one who sent Oliver in the first place?
Yeah, that's the part that's always confused me too. Basically, they're just saving this engine from their boss, whom they also work for till they're scrapped. It feels like, well...
A disturbing look at dictatorship and slavery? Slaves begging for the lives of their fellow slave friends?
Yeah, that's a ticket. A disturbing look at dictatorship and slavery. And you gotta wonder, how many other trains have they not happened to stumble upon in the diesel yard? How many engines have they tried to rescue and failed to convince their boss to spare their lives? We know Edward also saved Trevor from being scrapped, so this is probably a regular occurrence for them. Sir Topham Hatt may be spouted as the hero of Thomas, but in reality,
He's the Grim Reaper of these trains,
getting final say on whether they're useful enough to stay
or whether they die.
The engines are lucky with Oliver though, as the controller needs one extra engine at their station, so the station fixes up Oliver good as new.
And even despite the very dark undertones, it's still a very emotionally thrilling episode. And the music is among the most intense, flourishing soundtracks I've ever heard in the show. And intentionally or not, I like that the creators of Thomas were open about this dark underside of their show. Escape is the only episode that reveals the true nature of these sentient engines' lives, and on the rare occasions they can cheat death. And for that, I personally consider this the darkest, but also a fantastic Thomas episode. And my deepest respects go to Michael Angelis, who sadly recently passed away. This guy was the voice of my childhood and so many others, narrating Thomas's adventures for 21 years, and doing so with a smooth, calm, pleasant, but never condescending voice. Michael was a class act for his entire 21 years voicing Thomas's adventures, and the show isn't the same without him. He was part of what made it. And like Michael always did, many English kids shows like Thomas try hard to credit kids with intelligence. And it's a show that knows it's okay to explore fear and the unknown with kids in a safe, controlled environment. Because as Mr. Rogers would say, anything that is mentionable is manageable. On a side note, I've been trying to figure out why this show has a larger adult following. And I think it's partly because of that grace, art, and care they put into the show. From the gentle, majestic narrator to the beautifully laid out scenery and models. Like Sesame Street, I've personally got plenty of time for this show, and I give the creators credit for their hard work. And thanks for coming on the show again, George. I always find these lists way more fun with your help.
No problem, Strider. These were a bit darker than I thought, but I'm glad I could help. If you need my help again, I'll be exploring mysteries on my channel, BlameitonJorge.
You can bet I'll be there. And as always, Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ow.